So in this lecture, I want to talk about Aristotle's doctrine of the mean. And this will be really important to understanding what a virtue is for Aristotle, and also how he might meet some of the challenges to his whole picture, right? So remember in the first lecture we talked about, Aristotle thinks that, a life of virtuous activity is a good answer to this question of, well, what is eudaimonia? And remember, part of the challenge was, well, maybe being virtuous won't be that pleasant, right? We talked about that. If you are truly virtuous, you have to feel the right way about doing the right thing. But you still might worry, and we'll talk about this, are the virtues really good for the person who has them? We'll talk about one possible worry and how this doctrine of the mean can address it. So I think, by this point, it's probably good to go on. Aristotle hasn't really given this list yet. He will in the next reading that we talk about for next week. But I think it's worthwhile just to go through really quickly. Don't worry about copying these down. These will pop up again in next week's lectures. I'll go into them in a lot more depth. But it's good to just give you kind of a rundown of Aristotle's list of virtues. So, basic Aristotelian list: courage, temperance, or self-control, generosity, justice, proper pride, proper ambition, good temper, honesty, wit, and friendliness. Some of these will be called different things in your reading when you get to them. Just look, it's all in Greek. There are different ways to translate it. But I think it's good to have this list on the table just to think about how Aristotle's virtues might start to apply to the real world, how he might start to do that, and also to meet another objection. And that objection is this: can't virtues be bad for you? Think about generosity, right? If you are too generous, people will take advantage of you. If you are too generous, your life might not be good because you won't spend enough time on yourself. You will, have a bad life. Wouldn't it, Aristotle says the virtues are good for the person who has them. Well, wouldn't it be better if you weren't really generous, but maybe something a little less? Or what about courage? You could say to Aristotle, well, okay, Aristotle, I get it. A bit of bravery might be good. If I'm afraid of everything, if I spend my life quaking in fear, that would be terrible for me. I wouldn't get the things I want out of life, and that would just be miserable to boot. But if you're too brave, you might get yourself killed, and you might get yourself killed for stupid reasons. Well, so then if that's true, is it really true that the virtues are good for the person who has them? Here's what Aristotle will say. Aristotle, and I think, he doesn't really introduce it this way in the reading, but I think it's important as a way of meeting this objection. Aristotle says that virtues are usually, it's not clear whether he thinks always or just usually. I think for reasons we'll get into next week, usually is a better answer. But at least usually the virtue is a mean between two opposed vices. For example, courage is a mean being an average. A better way to speak of this might be balance, but courage is a mean or balance between the vice of cowardice and the vice of rashness. The coward is frightened too much. He runs away when he shouldn't. He fails to face danger. The rash person faces danger when he shouldn't. And here's what Aristotle will say. Here's what I think makes this interesting. Aristotle will say the virtue is usually closer or more like one vice than another. Courage is more like rashness, more like facing danger stupidly than it is cowardice. Well, because of that, we often mistake the virtue for the vice it's more like. The rash person, the person who just, has no fear, who gets himself killed for stupid reasons, Aristotle would say he's not truly courageous. He is in fact rash. We will sometimes mistake him for courageous, though, because courage looks more like this vice of rashness than it does cowardice. Nobody ever mistakes the coward for the brave person, but we often mistake the rash person for the brave person. So you say, well, can't courage be bad for you because the courageous person might get himself killed for stupid reasons? And Aristotle would say, no, that's not courage, that is rashness. Well, what about generosity? Well, generosity is probably, Aristotle presents it as a mean between the vice of, I forget his exact words, but being stingy and this vice of, I forget his terminology exactly, but basically being too giving. Generosity isn't bad, but being too giving might be. So why might we think generosity is bad? Because we mistakenly confuse generosity and being too giving. Generosity is closer to that vice than it is the vice of stinginess, so it's easy to confuse them. Might be the case with the other virtues. Real virtues aren't bad for you. The vices that are closer to the virtues might be, and we are, in fact, they will be, and we are prone to confusing them with the virtues because they look more like the virtues. One final claim, and Aristotle hasn't talked about this yet, but I think it will be important, is this so-called unity of the virtues. Now, we'll say a lot more about this next week. This will get pretty controversial, but I think there's a real insight here. And Aristotle says part of what the unity of the virtues means is that the virtues take account of one another. So think about being too giving. One reason being too giving is not a virtue. One reason that letting people take advantage of you is not a virtue is that it doesn't take account of other virtues. Think about these other virtues. Well, if you're too generous, you probably give to people who don't deserve it. Well, that's not just, right? If you let yourself be taken advantage of, you probably have too low an opinion of yourself. That doesn't show proper pride. So Aristotle will say the virtues take account of each other. To explain why being too giving is not a virtue, you have to reach for the fact that it doesn't take account of other real virtues. That is what makes it different, or one of the things that might make it different from, real generosity takes account of the virtues. Being too giving might not take account of the proper virtues. Or think of courage, right? Well, the rash person who gets in a fight for a stupid reason, what might he be missing? He might be too prideful, right? He might lack good temper. He might be a hothead. He probably is a hothead. So why is this rashness and not proper courage? Well, one of the ways you can explain the difference is with these virtues. The truly courageous person doesn't just fly off the handle and get in a fight. He has good temper. The truly courageous person isn't thin-skinned. He isn't looking to be offended and angry. He has proper pride. He doesn't have too much pride. So this will be important. The virtues take account of one another. Be really important to keep in mind when we actually get to the virtues and start talking about the individual virtues next week.